not always dependent on a finished product. It's not something that comes in at the end of a product, a project even. It's something that we can do at any stage. So that's just a quick sort of high level what exploratory testing is. I talked about planning exploratory tests and scoping them out. There's different ways that we can do that. And one way that I've seen do, because this is a question that comes up a lot, is just simply by having your test ideas, time boxing them and prioritizing them. Usually we come up with, we look at all our risks, we look at everything we want to check out from a testing perspective, we prioritize them and we work with our teams in order to prioritize them to make sure that we're giving information to a team that's useful, and then we time box them to make sure that we can work out how long we want to spend on any given area of testing. It's really key that the prioritization is done with the team to make sure any information that comes out of this exploratory testing is relevant and useful. We can obviously feed into that as testers, but we need our team to sort of say, well, yeah, we are working on that, or we're not working on that. One thing where people fall down a lot when it comes to this planning is trying to do everything, and they're trying to find all the information. We don't necessarily need to find out everything, we just need to find out everything that's useful. So we need to discuss that with the team. And with time boxing, this is something that's really important, because we have to make sure we're really strict and we don't go over things. If we find that when we come to the end of a time box, that we say, yeah, okay, there's still information that I need to know, what we can do is we can throw either retests or new test ideas down to the bottom of our test list and reprioritize them. The important thing about reprioritizing is to say, is depth of knowledge, so really focusing in one area, more important than breadth of knowledge about all the areas that we were going to look about. So that's a key thing there. And these are just really high level notes. We'll go into some stuff as the Q&A progresses. We can do the exact same thing rather than Excel. I've got a mind map here where this first thing here shows that you can prioritize different areas. You can ask questions and add to your mind map. You can descope, or you can showcase, where tests have either been good or bad, what results, where you've got information. And this is a really visual way of sharing information, doing that same planning, but just in a different way for your team to collaborate with. So the key thing when choosing to share information or show your planning for your testing is just whichever way is going to work for your teams, how to showcase it, how to make it visual, how to make it useful for everyone. The next big question that I usually have had to answer when I come into teams is, how does it fit into agile development? And there's usually a problem with Scrum or Fall. And what I mean by that is we tend to see something like this, where you'll have, and let me put a laser pointer on so you can see, there we go, where like the whole sprint will just be development. It'll be packed chocker full, and then we'll drop into test in the next sprint, or we'll do this, and that's like optimistic. We end up crossing, sort of squishing this down. We don't give enough time for testing, or we're still working in that waterfall kind of view where development all happens and then we throw it into testing. And that's something we want to try and move away from in agile development. What we're trying to really work towards is this kind of thing, where we have development and testing happening in parallel, and that can either be done through pairing, that can be done through TDD or BDD, things like that, working and collaborating and discussing with the developers and testers in your team. Or doing something like this, where we have some testing of ideas and design up front. We're spending some time automating in the sprint, and then testing what was developed in the sprint. And those tests, from our exploratory standpoint, would then go in and feed into the next sprint's automation. So we're automating our regression, like a sprint, basically a sprint behind, where we actually want to be developing. But the testing needs to be happening like that. And that's a tricky one to put into place. One thing we can do is we can start to see testing more like this. Normal testing has scripted testing. So our traditional testing, where we have to have something developed. We, at development, start either unit testing, writing tests, automating. We dump it into a test environment and do testing there, and then release and beyond release, we might have some checks as well. in order to move ourselves more towards having that parallel test and develop, we need to also be moving our questioning and exploratory testing into this kind of arena. So looking at ideas, looking at the design, looking at artifacts, doing things like 3 amigos and saying, okay, well, what does that mean? What about negative cases? Bringing that into development. So doing TDD, coming up with ways of thinking of more test ideas during unit tests, service tests, helping teams to write integration tests, because it's a dirty little secret that teams tend to be quite bad at integration testing, sort of helping with that kind of thing, and then doing the full exploratory testing of the product or components of the product, and looking at things release and beyond release as well. And by doing all of that, we can fit into continuous delivery models as well. Exploratory testing is really key in continuous delivery. It's not an automate everything kind of arena by any means. As I said, you use your exploratory testing to inform what you're going to automate. So in any given sort of like phase of your project, if you're doing development, you'll explore and find out information about what you're developing. Move into then automating out the cases that you think are useful in that sort of situation. And the same with things like committing. You might commit with different network speeds, you might commit with different sized environments, different environment statuses, whether or not things cut off partway through your commit and whether it can recover. Find out that and then start to look at automating these things as well. The reason that automation is so key and that they go hand in hand is that exploratory testing will tell us what to automate, and we need to automate a lot of regression things to give us the time to do exploratory testing. Next thing that usually I have to go through a lot when I'm coming into new teams, or that I get asked about, is how to introduce it as a concept to teams. And the team will usually start out with a big sort of skepticism. Why should we even do this? And usually that just comes from a place of not knowing what benefits they're going to get from it, or even what it is. Whenever you join a team, and especially if you're going to implement exploratory testing into that team, you want to start talking about it. Start saying what this is, and make a contract between yourselves and the rest of the team by saying, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explore the risks related to things up front as part of 3 amigos, come up with risk maps, put those into things. I'm going to give information, on a daily basis to the developers, add them to the ticket, do whatever, debrief people, set that expectation so that people know what you've come in to do and what to hold you account for. And that way, then you can start to hold people to account as well. And it will show people what's in it for them. So it will start to decrease that skepticism. They'll start to see value in it. They also start to say things like, we don't need testing, we're fallible, we've got unit tests. We're really key to say that by doing this kind of testing, it's not test versus development. We're not here to try and prove people wrong. We're here to provide useful information to try and help things. And we're going to do that in a timely way so that it's useful. If that means coming up with better risk assessments through exploratory testing to cover off negative edge boundary cases early before we've even developed so that we can write better unit tests, let's do that. We're here to provide that information and support it. It's also worth talking to developers to show that unit testing can't show us everything, especially when you start to think about any sort of front end or user experience. A unit test, it's going to be really difficult to say, does this feel good to use, or does this have charisma to use? So we can't rely on that. And also, like I said before, integration tests tend to be one of those things that gets dropped down. So that's an area that we can really help in as well. People say, this will slow us down. We're now having to take time to do this additional testing or just do testing, and it will slow us down. So to answer that, we need to show that we can plan and prioritize exploratory testing. We need to show that we're here to give useful point of time information, that we're not here to try and find out everything we can about a product, just what's useful to the team. So we're not trying to drag out sprints by saying, oh, we've got 50 years worth of infinite testing. at the end of the sprint. We're here to say, okay, here's the types of things that we think might be risky. What do we want to know about? Because if we try and just find out everything, we end up with massive defect backlogs that never get touched. We can talk about how shifting left saves time. So moving our testing into that, talking about design, thinking up risks up front means that we're going to develop the right thing initially, rather than, looking till the end, and that's going to speed us up. And as I've said, testing what's useful rather than everything. And if we automate our regression, that's going to speed us up as well. We're not going to use exploratory testing to do all of our regression testing each time, because that would slow us down. But if we use point of time, useful, fast, and informed automation, that's going to help us with our speed overall. And all that leads into is a what do we get out of it kind of thing. And really, it just comes down to explaining to your team about giving product information to them. That as a whole team, we're going to take ownership of quality, but from exploratory testing and using those techniques, we can champion quality by finding out information about the product and giving that to the team and helping the rest of the team to find out what's good about the product and even improve it. And we can use exploratory testing in pairing, or we can debrief from our exploratory testing to increase product knowledge over every member of the team. And we can also use that knowledge then to help debugging systems or work out where we need to put information to help debug our systems. So it's something that developers and whole teams really get a lot out of by learning more about their product, not having things locked away in people's heads, and it just helps with speeding up debugging and things like that. One of the really biggest questions that we get is, why don't we just automate absolutely everything? Why do we even need exploratory testing? In modern design, in CI/CD pipelines, as we saw from that diagram, why don't we just have automation? It'll be quick, it will drop things into our environments, it will be safe. Well, the good thing about automation, it is quick to run, but it's also slower to get started. And it does, quite often need something to be built in order to run the tests against it. It also can only really confirm or check things. It has to be specific and gives us a sort of pass-fail. That's sort of the automation is the how we test something when we know about it. But exploratory testing, the other side of things, is the what do we test? And that finds information about a system. And it's fast to get started. As soon as you have an idea about a product, you can start testing the idea. You can start questioning it and saying things like, well, do we need that? What happens if it fails? What happens in this situation? What if my user's blind? We can start asking those questions so we can immediately get started. It's also completely flexible. Automation has to run on Rails, and it will say, do this, do this, do this, pass, do this, do this, do this, pass. With exploratory testing, we can go, ooh, this failed. What about getting more information about this? And that comes because it's intuitive. We use a lot of human factors here. We can use the human element of our testing to say, well, what are we looking for here? And that all culminates in telling us what to check. Exploratory testing leads to better automation. If we just focus on requirements and we just focus on happy paths with our automation, we're not going to have a good picture of a whole product. We're just going to have a picture of what somebody thought about at the requirements level or when they were building it. Whereas if we start informing that automation through information we found when we're actually using a product, we'll actually start to get something out of it and get a better quality overall. So that was a really high-level run-through of some really basic top-level questions that I sometimes get asked. But I wanted to give a lot of time over for you all to ask me whatever you want to know. And I think Ashley's going to mediate for us. So I'll hand to him quickly.
Yeah, thank you very much, Callum. Yes, we've got a few questions coming through. I think you covered off some parts of some of these questions, but maybe we can go a little bit further on them. I mean, one of them, though, initially is, how do you teach exploratory testing to people new to testing? So, yeah, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It definitely is something that is quite a big concept to get your head around initially. What I tend to do, I've actually got some workshops that I run where I go through and explain the concepts of exploratory testing, and it has a lot of diagrams in it, like the one that you saw with the timeline of things, to give like a general context of exploratory testing and the why we do it. And also what's in it for people. From there, what I tend to do, and especially when I'm working in a new team and I'm working with developers or new testers, is I pair with them. I showcase what exploratory testing is and how to do it, and all of the heuristics or the ways of doing things that I know by actually sitting down with somebody and working together with them. A really good way of doing that is to have one person drive the screen and one person to take notes initially, so that you've then got somebody that's talking to the other person to say, okay, I'm going to try this, I'm doing it because of this, I'm doing it because of this. The other person is taking notes and being engaged as well. And then after a session, swapping over, so that the other person gets a chance to try some of these things out, and the other person gets a chance to try the note taking and making sense of what the testing is. So a lot of it does come to initially setting the scene, showcasing things. And then from there, what we can do is we can do that pairing to give that actual training on things, because the best way to do something is to, well, the best way to learn to do it is to do it, I find. And I'll try to use something that's more functional initially to give people sort of like an easier route into it. If you start by saying, oh, here's a deconstructed service or an API, let's get going. They might be a bit like, ooh, well, what's the exploration around that? Whereas if you start off with something that's a bit more functional and start saying, well, how would a user use this? How are the different ways we can break it? How can we do a positive flow, find boundaries and break them? That's a bit more meaningful to somebody who's new to it. So we try that out.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, moving on. Have you used exploratory testing in a setting where auditing everything you want to do is important? Finance, for example, how do you display your test evidence?
Yeah, definitely. So in the finance world, yeah, there is usually a big need or a big ask for auditing. There are two different ways that you can showcase that when you're doing exploratory testing. So the first way is when you're doing your test notes. So whenever you're doing exploratory testing, remember, we've got to plan it. So we've got to come up with a document that's going to say, here are all the things we're going to test. And then from that, when we're doing our testing, we're going to take notes where we're doing it. I talked about when we're pairing, somebody was going to take notes. Sometimes I have examples of those, but I've switched computers recently, so I don't have necessarily some examples right here. Let me just quickly see if I can open something for us. This is, nope, never mind. There we go. If I pull this open and I open my blog, I think I've got some examples here. So when we're taking our test notes, we can capture a lot of test evidence as part of that as well. Here we go. And what I mean by that, hopefully there should be a diagram, something like this. In our test notes, we can showcase the flows of the system we went through. So this is like logging into a UI, go to this page, have a look at where things are. We can capture a lot of information there. And that can be used if we attach it to tickets, if we attach it to TestRail, if we attach it to Jira as evidence of the testing that we've done. Do I have it? And the tool that I use is XMind to do that with. You can easily dump in screenshots, logs, whatever you want in order to showcase the results of what testing you've had. Another thing that you can do is to, oh, I'm hoping you saw that and it wasn't just my screen. Another thing that you can do is you can use the automation that comes out of the exploratory testing as your auditing. So in automation, obviously you have outputs and you have reports that come out of your automation. Exploratory testing can be used to inform what you want to automate and to improve the product generally. So from that, you do your exploratory testing, inform the automation, and then use the automation as your way of auditing your system. That should be sufficient as well. But I've definitely done it, and it's something that it takes a little minute for people to understand the value of it, because people are very used to saying, oh, it's got to be done in this tool and you've got to put in these screenshots. And if there's a specific reason for that, that's great. What we tend to find is that auditors really just want to know, has testing been done? Where is it captured? So really, you can even start to question to say, well, what do we actually need to capture from this? Is it just enough to say, here's where the tests are, we've done it in an exploratory format, here's where they are. I don't think auditors ever really go through line by line by line, unless there's been like a massive problem to say, right, what script have you done where? And even if they do, they can see that in those flows that you do when you're taking notes from exploratory testing. So that was a really long answer.
No, perfect. So leading on from that then, would you, in your approach, would you prioritize exploratory testing, or would you sort of just go with automating the acceptance criteria straight away?
Again, it's a good question. And it comes down to, unfortunately, where the risk lies. If we've got clear acceptance criteria, then can we prioritize getting the team to do unit testing that's going to showcase that for us? Does it need to be done end to end, or can we support our team in doing unit testing and integration testing? And exploratory testing can form part of that, because we can start to question the design of things. So if when we're doing TDD, if we're like designing something, if we're writing unit tests for it properly, we can start to ask questions like, well, what happens if it fails? What happens if that API comes back with a 500? What should happen? So that's like doing the exploration part of it by questioning the design. And we should definitely prioritize having, that safeguard and prioritize having unit tests. When it comes to say something like, should we have a lot of end-to-end Selenium tests over exploratory testing? If we know clearly what needs to be in there, and we've got something and we need to start knocking these things out, knocking out tests for it, then yeah, if that's the riskier thing, definitely we need to do that, because what's more important to the team? Knowing that the happy path works, or finding more information out about the product? In some cases, it's going to be knowing that it works, in which case we should focus on the automation, because there might not be any TDD taking place, there might not be any unit tests or enough coverage of that at the very least, or that they're not doing the negatives. In some other instances, it may be, we don't know what this product does, we need to do the exploratory. And a situation that I've definitely found myself in the past is when I've been handed over a massive product or an architecture, and a whole new team has taken it over, and we don't know what it does a lot. And there were no unit tests around it. So what we tend to do is focus on the exploratory testing to find out information about the system, and use that to inform the regression testing, use that to inform the automated testing, and then prioritize that when we do know things. So yeah, it all comes down to context, unfortunately. So yeah, in CI/CD pipelines, if we've got a lot of drops happening, or we want to increase the amount of drops, then we need to make sure that our regression is much stronger. So we definitely need to focus on having stronger automated tests and prioritizing that. If we've got big projects where it's less likely that a code drop's going to come in, or they're going to come in with much less frequency, then maybe focus on the exploratory testing.
Okay, perfect. And in terms of the exploratory testing, what sort of exploratory testing should be done? Is it based on priority, features, persona, or risk?
All of those things.
Oh.
So when I start to come up with my exploratory tests, and let me start to share, let me share this. So if I've got a product, what I will tend to do initially is I will start to break those down into areas. Can you see that? There we go. I'll break that down into areas or concepts. So let's say if this is a chair, I might break that down into, say, like legs, things like seats, and then like theoretical things like location that it's going to sit in, or ergonomics, or whatever. I then will focus on what risks sit around there. So for legs, it might be that the legs will buckle, that they'll fall off, that one might be too big or too small. For the seat, it might be that it's uncomfortable, that it sets fire really easily, that it doesn't attach properly. For location, it might be that it's a really damp area. What if it's cloth? What if I can't fit it through a door? What if it doesn't fit into the space? What if it just doesn't match the decor of the rest of the room? And then those risks obviously lead me to exploratory tests. So explore the use of the chair with different weights to discover information related to the risk that the legs will buckle if really heavy people sit on it. When I've got those, I can start prioritizing what we think is important. So legs, things collapsing, like the risk of collapsing, yeah, that's really important. Legs, you know, all of them not meeting the ground, so the chair's really wobbly, it's going to be really problematic, really important. The seat, it's not comfortable, yeah, people might be able to live with that, secondary priority. That it doesn't attach properly, or it's a cushion, yeah, we could probably work around that, so it might be less of a priority. Location, does it look pretty? That's like our least priority. Does it fit into the space? Really important. So there's some areas there that we need to prioritize. And when I'm doing this, I'm not doing it just in isolation. I'm working with my team as well to say, you know, is this something we all think is important? We can do things like risk storming to come up with these risks as well and set out the priorities amongst our team. So once I've done this, I can start to say, okay, here are my risks. Here are the priorities of those. So here are the tests that I've prioritized and time boxed. And I can keep those you know, up to date as a living document. I could say that's going to be an hour, that's going to be 2 hours, that's going to be like 3 hours. And when I start to see that all of my high priority things are going to go over the amount of time that we've got for the sprint or that, that's when we have to have a discussion as a team to say, do we actually need this information, or how much of this information? Do we need breadth of information around this risk and other risks, or do we need depth about this problem? Can we deprioritize some things? So that's one way of looking at risk. And then as part of that, when we're coming up with these risks, definitely we can use things like personas. Personas are a really good heuristic. Thinking about having empathy for the way that our users think about things. So we could say that one of the risks of the legs is my user's really angry and they want to start ripping legs off. How easy is that? My chair is really, or my user's really sleepy. You know, is the seat comfortable to nap on? Or my user's really happy. You know, is the location, is the aesthetic something that is going to go well with their mood at the time? And I was using 7 dwarves there as user personas because that's just a quick and easy one for me to wrap my head around. That was an old D&D trick for NPCs. But yes, so definitely when coming up and planning the exploratory testing, think about things in terms of breaking it down into concepts or bits of your product. So it may be that you're thinking about data, it may be you're thinking about APIs, front end, back end, code, saving it, storage, everything like that. Think about risks, and those risks may relate to users and personas, and then come up with your tests from there and prioritize it all accordingly by working with your team to say, you know, from a business and an architectural and a technical standpoint, what's important to us? What do we need to know right now? Because most times, like, there'll be areas that people don't care so much about and risks that people don't care so much about now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and I've got one here just based on that, I guess. So what tools do you use for documenting the process? Is there anything that you recommend personally, and have you heard of test and feedback?
So I've heard of the process of test and feedback, which the debriefing. So if whoever wants that, if they mean debriefing, then yes, definitely. So debriefing is really vital to any sort of exploratory testing. Once we've finished our time box, once we've finished our testing, we need to take that back to the team, whoever worked on it, whoever the expert in that code is, to say, here's what I found, here's what questions I have about it, here's what issues I potentially found about it, and also, really importantly, here's what's awesome about the product. Whenever we're giving feedback, whenever we're debriefing someone, make sure to tell them that what's good about what you've looked into, because that will not only show that you're working with the team, that you're not here to just try and, you know, get one over on them. It will also showcase what they should continue to be doing, what sorts of things feel good to use, what sorts of product designs were a good choice. And it'll just build up your rapport with your team as well. When it comes to tools, I've tried out lots of them, and really it doesn't matter which ones you use. It just depends on what works best for yourself and for the team. You saw right there, I was actually using XMind, which is a mind mapping tool. I use things like this quite a lot. So XMind 8 is a really good free tool to use. You can pay a bit of money and it will export your mind maps into PDF for sharing, which is really good. I've seen people take videos of their sessions. If you've got enough storage space and the hookup for it, that's great, or audio. I've seen people sketchnoting, writing things on bits of paper. If you do that, then make sure that it's in a consumable format, so people can, you can type it up and you can store it somewhere that other people can get hold of it. And yeah, I've seen people using Word documents. There's some really good tools out there. If you look up Test Buddy, Test Buddy is a little application that will sit on your screen, and that will allow you to type in one line at a time to build something like this. But it'll be like, I'm doing this, I found this out, this might be a bug. And you can use that for debriefing as well. And if I just showcase that at Test Buddy, I'm assuming you can see the browser right now. But that's this is a really good tool as well for using. So either XMind or Test Buddy, I would say, are. There you go.
There we go.
So yeah, XMind, if you want to do mind mapping and try that out, I definitely think it's really good for visual people and keeping things up to date. And even you can use it for test planning, or something like Test Buddy. Or of course, there's always Excel. Lots of people like Excel, so you can use that as well. It's whatever works best for your brain and how you want to get that information across for people.
Perfect. Okay, and in a free Amigo meeting, what sort of questions should a tester be asking?
It's a good question. So when I come in for 3 Amigos, you have to think about what the purpose of that session is for, and it's to give you information in order to help inform testing and to inform the development of that product. So some things would be to ask if acceptance criteria is being written as part of the ticket grooming. Start to ask about what happens in the negative. So what happens if this fails? What happens in this situation? Do we want this response to come back or not? Think about negatives usually, because that's something that gets missed out a lot, because people will think about the happy path and then they won't think about what happens in the error conditions. Think about also up and downstream dependencies. So with the knowledge of the system that you do have, think about what about if this tool fails? What about if this downstream process fails? How will it flow back? And get that information as well. And then we need to be asking, is this something that you want risk analysis on? What kind of information can I get for you as soon as I go away from here? So we're not using the 3 Amigos so much to flesh out every risk and so on, because we can do that as soon as we've got the ticket in Jira or whatever tool. We can start to do the risk before we do the design and development. So as not to hold up everybody, but we just need to have enough information, and we need to make sure that everybody's got enough information to know how the system should work or should be developed and designed, and then what the design should sort of look like or what we want it to do in failure cases as well. So think about those. And then you'll tend to find your own heuristics for things as well. One thing that I do a lot of is if I've got an area that comes up a lot, like databases or APIs or front ends, I tend to just come up with lists of, or mind maps of all the risks that I can think of in those areas. And I can use that and I can come prepared for 3 Amigos to say, oh, well, this is an API, right? Problems that we might face are, you know, what about the contract? Is it going to fail? What if we put in this kind of data? What if we malform the payload? What if the network breaks? Things like that we can start to just come along with. And it may be that that would be more useful during the actual design of it, but some of that information might be useful if at the highest level, coming back to sort of the 3 Amigos session.
Okay, perfect. And how do you estimate how long something will take if you don't know how buggy it is?
T-shirt sizes. If I think something's going to be really complicated, I will give it a big. And then if I think something that's quite small, I'm not going to take a lot of time into it, then I'll give it a small. Anything in the middle, I'll give a medium. And I tend to standardize what that means in terms of time. So I start off usually by saying something small, I'll take an hour on, something medium is a couple of hours, something big, I'm going to take like a morning on, like 3 hours or so on. And that's like an important way to go through it is to say, I need to make sure that I've got an amount of time that I'm going to focus on this and only this. So don't try and say, oh, my estimate for this charter, this test is 2 days, because you're not going to focus for 2 days. So I tend to say small, medium or big, focus that amount of time on it. If it then becomes really buggy, because I don't know if it's really buggy until I've actually had a look at it, then like I showed you before, what I will do, let me just share this. So I'm running this test and it's small and there's loads of bugs in it, and I've put my test notes in there. It was bad. What I might do is go retest or new test. That it was really buggy. People really care about getting more information about that. All right, that's my new highest priority. I'm probably going to want to spend 2 hours on that, so medium. And once I've run that, that may come up with more questions than answers. So then I'll do this and I'll say, okay, test ID from run of test 4. Sorry, my typing's bad. At this point now, we're getting into more abstracted testing. And we think we found things, but we just want to be careful or check after the fixes have come in. It's probably less important to us than finding out information in these areas, because I've talked to the developers about it. So maybe I'll put that as a 3. And if I don't run it, and that's going to be a medium as well, because it's quite big. And if I don't run it, that's because it was more important to do those things. But I already spent a lot of time in that area. So I basically, the way I get into that is I use my knowledge of the system, my knowledge of testing, what kinds of testing I might do in that area generally, but I tend to just keep it simple. I just say small, medium or big. That's how much time I'm going to spend on it. And then allow that to then come up with more tests as I even go through something. It may be when I first start planning my testing, I just have an initial test that's small, just to say, try using this feature to find out information about it and use that to come up with test ideas. And that's where I'll then start to dump more in. So that's one way of going about it and doing it. But if your team is asking you to estimate to the minute all of your tests as you come up with them, then you're spending too much time planning and not enough time doing your testing. So the question is, why are you spending all that time on planning and estimating? Because testing's infinite. It's more just about saying, here are all the ideas we've got right now, which ones are most important? Because otherwise we could plan for things like if an Aquarius starts to use this system while stood on one leg balancing strawberry jam on their head and clicks this button, what happens? What if it's pineapple jam? What if it's this? That information is not necessarily useful to anyone at this point. So why would we estimate for it?
Perfect. Leading on from that then, how do you deal with any offshoot avenues found during exploratory testing?
Yeah, so definitely. Exploratory testing is really flexible. It allows us to align to any opportunities that come up. If we see a problem, we might want to investigate more of that. So the important thing to take into account at any given time is that we obviously have a test charter. And our test charter, our test idea, is something that's giving us a ring fence to say, we are looking at this. This is the information that we said in this time we were going to try and find out about. And we've also got a time box. We said, we're only going to take 2 hours on this area. So you have to be very strict on yourself to say, is this important to find out about? If I'm looking at the UI and suddenly I notice a load of problems in the API, do I really want to take all of that UI time away from testing and finding out information about it? Probably not. What I tend to do is I make a note to say, I found issues here. There's probably a load of bugs. I need to come up with a new test idea. And then I add it to that list and prioritize it accordingly and do it. If it's something that is just going to take me a quick look, just to get a feel for it, then I tend to just be a bit flexible and do it. But if it's going to take me more than a couple of minutes, or if it's going to take more than like 10% of the time away from what I was actually trying to look at, I try and be really strict on myself. And that's why pairing is really important. If you're pairing on things, you've got that second person that say, is it important we look at this now, or is this something that we could come back to as part of a new test? So it's all about being strict on yourself to say, I've got this that I want to look at. If I start doing this too much and coming off it, is that something that I should prioritize and come back to? Because it might be interesting to me right now because I'm looking at that area, but is it interesting to us all when we're coming up with our development? But we shouldn't just be rigid. We should make sure that we give ourselves that sort of view of, no, actually, this is important. I will take a look at it. So it's very much a case of try it, trial it, make sure you can come back to things, make notes of it. Say, I've got this question that I want to investigate. When you're debriefing, go through those questions, go through it with the developer, go through it with the product owner and say, well, I've started to see issues in this area. Is that something that if I found information out that we'd probably want to fix it? If they say, yeah, get me that info, do it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, next question here. With shift left, is there value in doing exploratory testing as a team activity or best value as an individual activity?
Yeah, so the benefits to doing it as a team, if you've got an invested team that want to trial it out, then the benefits of it is it's going to improve quality overall. As testers in agile teams, we're coaches. And what we've come in to do is we've come to champion quality. We can't, as an individual, ensure quality of a whole product, especially if you've, say, got a team of 8 developers and 1 tester. Well, that means that you've got 8-to-1 amount of work going on. You're not going to be able to test it all. So as you start to do exploratory testing, as you start to improve the testing heuristics, testing knowledge, the ideas of what to look for, critical thinking and risk analysis skills of the rest of your team through doing that exploratory testing with them, and product knowledge as well, they're going to start thinking in those ways. They're going to start coming in and going, oh, actually, I can think about this thing that I learned from exploratory testing, think about the risks of things, add more unit tests, do a bit of testing myself, maybe go back and debrief the tester on the team, and they can say, oh, have you got any other ideas for me? They can start doing that risk analysis early, which is the whole premise of shift left, is to try and get that information as soon as possible. So do it as early as possible. And that's going to support you. The ideal position is basically being then saying that you've got all of your team doing exploratory testing, doing risk analysis, doing critical thinking. So it's high performing, everyone's testing, everyone's coming up with unit tests and so on that's going to support us. And really, you're just sort of there to help along, or maybe you can start upskilling in a different area. You can start, doing some of the unit testing rather than having to do all of that exploratory testing just by yourself. So that's the benefit of it. If we just do it in isolation, we're never going to be able to cover everything off. Silos worked well in waterfall, but they don't work so well in agile. So we need to break down that idea of the tester does the test activity, because quality is everyone's responsibility. You can champion it, and the way you champion it is by making sure that this kind of testing is happening, questioning whether it's happening, supporting with the testing skills you've got when it is happening, and working with your team to do that. So if you do it in isolation or as the sole person on the team, it's just going to mean that you end up with always lagging behind. You end up, like I had in that screenshot, let me go back to it. You'll end up in this kind of world where you're pushing out your testing. You won't end up here where your testing is happening in parallel, because not enough people are doing it in order to support the amount of testing that's needed for the amount of work that's going on. Because remember, like, a small change of code is going to require a lot of regression testing and a lot of checking around it. So, and a lot of exploration to find out what happens when this code is changed as well. So something that's like 5-minute code change done, sent off, might take hours to investigate properly. So it's worth knowing that and sort of bringing people on board to help you with it. So I've infected them with that quality mindset.
Okay, perfect. And Yeah, next question. Do you have any metrics to show how exploratory testing is adding value, or are the discussions of the validation of the exploration the best way, I guess, is that question?
Yeah. So, I mean, you've answered it yourself. Information. Exploratory testing gives us information about a product. Metrics, you can come up with metrics, but what's metrics going to tell you? Exploratory testing generally is infinite, and it's about getting information about a product. What is saying, oh, if you've got a pie chart that says, I've ran 95 out of about 250 tests. What does that tell me? I don't know what those tests are. I don't know anything about those tests. What I need to know, okay, I've looked at this API. I've looked at it with this and this inputs. I've done the contract testing around this and seen these outputs. There are probably problems about this malformed expression that comes out as a response. It's not ingested by this thing. That actually tells me something about the product. So metrics are something that management like to throw out there in order to sort of showcase that you're doing something. But the fact that you're doing something, you can use Jira to show that. Just put a ticket in to say I'm doing some testing and move it along. What benefit do those metrics give you? If you're desperate to showcase, or if you're in an environment that forces you to have metrics for things, one thing you can do, and let me go back to this, is let's just build out this a bit. So I've got some tests. I've got some test notes. That's one metric there. I can say time spent. I can say bugs found. So then I can start saying, okay, I spent 1 hour on this. I spent, I haven't run anything on that. I haven't run that, and I've spent 1 hour there. Oh no, that was a medium. Let's say I spent 1.5 hours there, and I found 10 bugs there, and I found 12 bugs there. It doesn't tell you much, but you can basically say, okay, in these areas, I found, this many bugs an hour. You could do that sort of measurement. You could add that on to say, okay, how many sort of test ideas did I go through within that hour? You can do. Depends what's beneficial to the team. What's really going to be beneficial to the team is the information you find out about the testing. So what is in these test notes? What have you actually investigated and found out? So definitely, if you've got a test manager or a project that is saying, I need metrics, you can do that. You can start to explore that and showcase it, or use your exploratory testing to inform your automated testing and run your metrics off of the automation testing to say, our automation suite has this many tests and this many of them are passing. So it's as good a quality, or it passed as many tests as it did previously. Remember that just, number of tests passed don't really tell us much about the quality of something, just tells us how many tests passed, because we don't know what those tests are. It could just be fire up IntelliJ. Yep, IntelliJ fired up, test passed. And that doesn't tell us anything about the product.
Okay, perfect. And I think there's time probably for one more question, just obviously approaching the hour now. So how do you maintain the importance of exploratory testing still taking place when a deadline is due or passed?
So that's good. So when we're doing exploratory testing, we're trying to find out useful information that we can use. If a deadline has passed, if they've shipped a product and so on, it's depending on the environment we're in. Let's assume sort of very big bang, they've shipped a product and they want to start working on a new set of requirements or a new thing. What is exploratory testing going to give you? What information is it going to give you to say, to do anything with? You'll end up with a load of defects on a backlog that basically don't relate to anything. Instead, what we can be doing is showing the usefulness of exploratory testing by making that point of time information available. So prior to the deadline, shifting left, doing what we can to get as much information to the team, to make things as good a quality as possible, building out as many people doing this kind of work to widen the net on how much information is going to be available, to just help with things. Once a deadline has passed, once something's shipped, we're probably going to get into a state of testing in prod, which is basically the users are going to find something and scream about it, and then we'll fix it. If you, as a member of the team, is screaming about something, you'll probably get a response back that's, well, if it happens in prod, it happens in prod. So there's those kinds of things. What you can do in those situations is use exploratory testing to support your developers, to support your DevOps, to support your any of your team members in debugging things and saying, okay, in these situations, let's add logs here, 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 and here. That might be more useful at that point. Get the logging up, make it easier to debug those issues, and then move on. But make sure that your testing is focused on what the whole team is looking at and don't lag behind. We tend to see a lot of cases where testers are get kind of in their heads and say, I need to know everything about this product. I need to have tested everything. But if the team's moved on, they're not interested in that information anymore, and you're just testing for yourself, you're not going to be able to debrief. You're not going to get things fixed or repaired. You might as well start looking at the new thing. But then, if you have found a lot of problems and you're able to showcase them and say, I've looked at this API, and in these situations, which are quite likely to happen, the whole thing blows up, you might be able to stop the release and get more work, or even change the focus of your next sprint into finding information about that, run a spike, and actually get it fixed. So you can keep things relevant when a deadline has passed by helping to support when you're testing in prod or when things are in prod, helping with the debugging of things, and just kind of letting go and saying, well, I didn't find out everything. Why didn't I find out everything? I didn't have enough time. I didn't either shift left enough to start looking at things early enough, or I didn't get enough people on board to help me look at the sheer amount of work there is. So I need to champion quality more or question things more. So I use it to do that.
Okay, perfect. And I think just one quick one here, I think, which will finish it off. Can you sum up exploratory testing in layman's terms?
Exploratory testing in layman's terms. When you get a new mobile, do you read the manual and do everything that the manual says, or do you just rip the cover off and start pushing buttons? If you do the second thing, just start pushing buttons to see what it does and find out what it does, that's exploratory testing.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Callum. Yeah, really enjoyed that. I think a lot of activity there and a lot of knowledge gained as well. We'll be sharing the video of this afternoon, so I'll send that round to everybody in the group and post that via our YouTube channel as well. We'll keep the Slido open, so if anyone's got any further questions, there's a few that have just come through as well. So we'll close those off and send those around later as well. But yeah, any other questions, feel free to reach out on the Slido app and we'll be able to come back to you on those over the next couple of days. But no, thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Callum, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks all.
See ya.